In less than a decade, Macy's went from an American icon to a slow-moving financial disaster. More than 150 stores are being shut down. Thousands of employees are gone. Entire shopping malls collapsed the moment Macy's lights went off. This wasn't a sudden crash. There was no single headline that screamed bankruptcy, no overnight implosion. Instead, this empire bled out in public, quarter by quarter, store by store, decision by decision. Picture this. A flagship department store the size of multiple football fields. Escalators running, lights still on, but the aisles are empty. No crowds, no excitement, no reason to stay. Behind the scenes, executives called it a strategic restructuring. Wall Street called it necessary optimization. But for millions of Americans, it felt like watching a national landmark quietly erased. This is not the story of a company that failed to make money. This is the story of a company that lost its purpose and kept pretending nothing was wrong. And once that happens, collapse is no longer a possibility. It becomes inevitable. Long before decline, before closures, before restructuring plans and earnings calls, Macy's was not just a retailer. It was the retail experience of America. Founded in 1858, Macy's grew alongside the country itself. As cities expanded and the middle class exploded, Macy's became the physical embodiment of American consumer optimism. If you wanted to understand how America shopped, dressed, celebrated, and dreamed, you walked into a Macy's store. At its peak, Macy's was everywhere. Downtowns, suburbs, shopping malls that depended on it as their anchor. By the late 20th century, Macy's operated hundreds of massive department stores, each designed to keep customers inside for hours. Clothing, cosmetics, furniture, kitchenware, jewelry, everything under one roof. And then there was Herald Square. The flagship store in New York City was not just a store, it was a landmark. Over 1 million square feet of retail space packed with foot traffic, seasonal displays, and holiday magic. For many tourists, visiting Macy's Herald Square was as essential as seeing Times Square or Central Park. Culturally, Macy's reached far beyond shopping. The Thanksgiving Day parade turned the brand into a national ritual. Generations of families grew up watching Macy's floats on television and walking into Macy's stores days later to start their holiday shopping. Financially, Macy's looked untouchable. Annual revenues climbed into the tens of billions of dollars. Wall Street treated it as a stable, mature, blue-chip retailer. Mall developers designed entire complexes around the assumption that Macy's would always be there. For decades, that assumption was never questioned. Macy's didn't just sell products, it sold tradition, sold familiarity. It sold the comforting belief that some American institutions were permanent. And that belief, more than any financial metric, is what made the fall so devastating. Because when a company built on permanence starts to disappear, it doesn't feel like a business problem. It feels like the end of an era. This is where everything went wrong. Not with a scandal, not with a bold but reckless bet, not with a single catastrophic headline. The fatal mistake of Macy's was far more dangerous than that. Macy's chose to defend a dying model instead of redefining its reason to exist. For years, leadership believed the problem was temporary. Foot traffic was down, cut costs. Margins were shrinking, close underperforming stores, sales were slipping, run bigger promotions, every decision made sense on paper. Executives convinced themselves that Macy's wasn't obsolete. The malls would stabilize, consumers would return. The brand was too iconic to fail, so instead of reinventing the experience, Macy's optimized it. They doubled down on massive stores designed for an era when shoppers wanted to spend entire afternoons browsing aisles. They protected real estate footprints that no longer justified their operating costs. They treated store closures as a solution, not a symptom. Behind closed doors, leadership framed these moves as strategic discipline. Investors heard margin improvement. Analysts heard efficiency. But customers experienced something very different. Stores felt emptier. Selections felt safer, blander, interchangeable. Sales events became constant, destroying any sense of value or urgency. Macy's wasn't offering something unique anymore. It wasn't cheaper than online retailers. It wasn't more exciting than specialty brands. And it certainly wasn't more convenient than e-commerce. The most damaging part, Macy's still believed scale was its advantage. In reality, scale had turned into an anchor. Every large format store required staffing, inventory, utilities, security, logistics, and marketing regardless of how many customers walked through the doors. As traffic declined, costs didn't fall fast enough to compensate. This wasn't a failure of awareness. Leadership saw the numbers. They saw the trend lines.
Nice.
They saw the malls decaying around them. But instead of asking a dangerous question, what is Macy supposed to be now? They asked a comfortable one. How do we survive one more year? And that mindset quietly transformed a legendary brand into something far worse than a failed company. It turned Macy's into a business with no clear future, only a managed decline. The backlash against Macy's didn't arrive as a viral scandal. There were no trending hashtags, no celebrity outrage, no explosive boycott campaigns. What happened was far more lethal. People simply stopped showing up. Foot traffic declined quietly, then relentlessly. Week after week, aisles grew wider, lines shorter, fitting rooms emptier. Shoppers didn't argue with Macy's. They didn't protest. They replaced it. Younger consumers scrolled past it. Online shoppers ignored it. Loyal customers aged out and were never replaced. Sales floors began to feel interchangeable with every other department store still clinging to life. The same promotions, the same brands, the same markdown signs that never ended. 50% off became background noise. 70% off became expected. Full price stopped meaning anything. Inside malls, the effect was immediate and brutal. When a Macy's location announced a closure, neighboring stores followed. Food courts emptied. Parking lots thinned out. Entire shopping centers entered a death spiral, all triggered by the loss of the anchor tenant they were built around. Employees felt it first. Hours were cut. Departments were consolidated. Customer service suffered as fewer workers were expected to cover massive floors. The shopping experience didn't just decline, it deteriorated visibly. Wall Street noticed too. Each earnings call became a test of patience. Analysts stopped asking about growth and started asking how much more could be cut. Investors no longer debated upside potential. They debated survival timelines. The most damning sign wasn't outrage. It was indifference. Macy's had become invisible in a retail world dominated by speed, personalization, and obsession-level brand loyalty. It wasn't hated. It wasn't controversial. It was irrelevant, and irrelevance is fatal. By the time leadership acknowledged the severity of the situation, the damage was already embedded in consumer behavior. Shoppers had moved on. Habits had changed. Loyalty had evaporated. When customers leave quietly, there is no warning siren. There's no second chance. No dramatic moment to reverse course. Only empty stores, and the slow realization that the market has already passed judgment. At this point, denial becomes impossible, because the numbers tell a story no press release can hide. Over the last decade, Macy's has gone from a retail powerhouse to a shrinking footprint, fighting gravity. Store count fell from nearly 800 locations at its peak to around 450. With 150 additional closures planned, that is not optimization, that is retreat. Revenue tells the same story. Annual sales, that once comfortably sat above $25 billion, slid year after year. By the mid-2020s, Macy's was generating billions less than it did just a few years earlier, even before adjusting for inflation. In real terms, the business shrank faster than the headline numbers suggest. Profitability followed. Margins thinned to the point where a single bad quarter could erase an entire year of gains. Net income collapsed from billions in strong years to barely positive, sometimes negative results. Earnings calls stopped celebrating growth and started explaining why things were less bad than expected. The stock market responded accordingly. Macy's share price lost a massive portion of its long-term value, underperforming the broader market while competitors with clearer identities surged ahead. Where investors once saw stability, they now saw risk. Where they once priced confidence, they now priced uncertainty. Then there's the hidden cost. Each store closure triggered severance payouts, asset write-downs, and impairment charges. Inventory markdowns became routine. Promotions ate into margins just to move unsold goods. The company was working harder to earn less. the most dangerous equation in business, and perhaps the most telling number of all. Digital sales growth failed to compensate for the collapse in physical retail. Online revenue rose, but nowhere near fast enough to offset the decline of the stores that once defined the brand. This wasn't a temporary dip, it was a structural contraction. The financial data didn't signal a turnaround. It got so? It confirmed a long, measurable descent. To understand why Macy's kept declining even after aggressive restructuring, you have to look past surface-level explanations like e-commerce and inflation. Those forces hurt everyone. They did not destroy everyone. The real failure was strategic misalignment at every critical layer of the business. First, Macy's lost clarity on who its customer actually was. For decades, the brand served a clearly defined middle-class shopper, aspirational, brand-aware, price-conscious, and loyal. But as the middle of the market hollowed out, Macy's never chose a side. It did not become cheaper, faster, and more convenient than mass retailers. And it did not become more premium, curated, or emotionally compelling than specialty brands. Instead, it drifted, offering good enough products to a customer who no longer existed. Second, the company mistook scale for strength. Large format stores once created dominance. Later, they created inertia. Every additional square foot increased fixed costs while delivering diminishing returns. Rather than questioning whether those spaces should exist at all, leadership focused on squeezing efficiency out of them. This produced short-term financial relief and long-term strategic paralysis. Third, Macy's treated digital as a channel, not a transformation. The company invested in online sales, apps, and omni-channel logistics. But digital was bolted onto a legacy structure designed around physical stores. Inventory, pricing, and promotions were still optimized for in-store clearance cycles, not for speed, personalization, or discovery. As a result, Macy's online presence never felt native, addictive, or indispensable. Fourth, leadership optimized for optics instead of reinvention. Store closures, layoffs, and cost controls reassured investors temporarily. But none of these actions answered the fundamental question. Why should a customer choose Macy's today? Strategy meetings focused on margin preservation, not value creation. The business became reactive, responding to declining numbers rather than reshaping demand. Finally, timing turned every move into a disadvantage. Many of Macy's initiatives would have been bold 10 years earlier. When they arrived, competitors had already moved faster, learned quicker, and locked in customer loyalty. Macy's wasn't wrong, it was late. And in retail, being late is often indistinguishable from being irrelevant. The tragedy is that this was not ignorance, it was hesitation. Leadership understood the threats. They saw the data, they recognized the decay. But they tried to manage decline instead of confronting identity. And when a company built on identity loses the courage to redefine itself, no amount of cost-cutting can save it. When decline becomes undeniable, accountability always follows. Inside Macy's, the collapse did not trigger a single dramatic firing. Instead, it produced something quieter, a steady erosion of leadership stability. Executives rotated in and out. Strategies were renamed, repackaged, and relaunched. But the direction never truly changed. As performance continued to weaken, pressure from investors intensified. Cost discipline replaced vision as the primary leadership metric. Entire teams were restructured. Layers of management were removed. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, not because they failed, but because the system around them no longer worked. At the top, leadership transitions were framed as renewal. In reality, they reflected exhaustion. Each new executive inherited the same unsolved problem: how to fix a brand whose relevance was fading faster than its balance sheet. Boardrooms grew more cautious, risk tolerance collapsed. Long-term bets became politically dangerous. The safest move was to preserve cash, protect near-term earnings, and avoid anything that could fail publicly. That mindset shaped every major decision. Innovation slowed. Experiments shrank. Bold ideas died in committee. What emerged was not a turnaround culture, but a survival culture, one obsessed with minimizing damage rather than creating momentum. No leader could fully escape the fallout. Reputations were bruised, careers stalled, and the burden of past decisions continued to haunt every strategic conversation. In the end, leadership didn't collapse because of incompetence. It collapsed because the organization no longer allowed courage. And when leadership becomes defensive, decline stops being a risk, becomes policy. The collapse of Macy's offers a lesson far more uncomfortable than adapt or die, because Macy's did adapt. It cut costs, closed stores, it invested in digital. It still kept falling. The real lesson is this: efficiency cannot replace identity. For decades, Macy's relied on cultural memory as a competitive advantage. Leadership assumed that tradition would translate into loyalty, and loyalty would translate into sales. But customers do not shop out of nostalgia. They shop out of relevance. When a brand can no longer clearly answer why it exists, customers will answer that question for it by leaving. Another lesson is about the danger of the middle. Macy's tried to serve everyone and ended up being essential to no one. It was not cheap enough to win on price, not distinctive enough to win on experience, not fast enough to win on convenience. In trying to offend no one, it failed to excite anyone. There is also a hard truth about leadership. Managing decline is easier than reinventing purpose. It is safer, it is measurable, and it is almost always rewarded in the short term. But businesses that choose comfort over reinvention do not collapse suddenly. They decay slowly, publicly, and irreversibly. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: you don't lose when customers complain. You lose when they stop caring. Anger can be addressed. Backlash can be managed. Silence cannot. Macy's didn't just lose market share. It lost emotional relevance. And in modern business, that loss is almost impossible to recover from. The story of Macy's isn't just about one company. It's about what happens when an empire survives long enough to outlive its purpose. So here's the real question: was Macy's collapse inevitable, or was it preventable? If you want more deep, unfiltered breakdowns of iconic businesses that quietly fell apart, make sure to subscribe. These stories don't end with one company. I repeat. And if you had to choose the next empire to dissect, which one should it be? Because somewhere right now, another legendary brand is making the same mistake, and history is watching.